we help sectors that are affected by the tariffs, by the US tariffs. So we're thinking about steel, aluminum, and lumber because we need to support the workers. And at the same time, we're very much aware that we need to strike the right balance. We need to make sure that indeed prices don't go up. And that's going to be the job of the procurement minister to make sure that that's the case.
For decades, Canadian mills, foundries, and parts suppliers tuned their output to specification sheets written in Detroit, Houston, and Washington. That model delivered scale, but it also made planning vulnerable to policy shocks south of the border. A different approach is emerging, retooling core industries to prioritize Canadian demand, Canadian standards, and Canadian supply chains while keeping trade open where it makes sense. The goal is resilience first, exports second, and it is being formalized across procurement, energy, transportation, and defense.
We're seeing that in the US, we're seeing that in the EU, in Asia as well. And so as these countries themselves are doing their own by, France or by EU policies, we need to be able to react because we need to be able to protect our own workers and our own industries. So that's why we're coming up with that policy.
New guidance states that suppliers from Canada and trusted partners will be prioritized, and that key inputs such as domestic steel and softwood lumber will be required on selected defense and construction contracts above defined thresholds.
The problem we have right now in our steel industry is a lot of our steel plants have been developed on a model to serve the U.S. auto market. And the type of steel they develop is not necessarily the type of steel that is required for construction. So while we're coming up with new major projects such as LNG pipelines or things that will require a lot of steel, we need to help our steel plants to pivot and adapt and develop the type of steel, to produce the type of steel that is required.
This is designed to lock in local content without breaching trade obligations, and the policy architecture leaves room to add more materials over time as capacity builds. Canada has learned hard lessons about volatility. In 2018, foreign tariffs on steel and aluminum landed with little warning, and Canada retaliated before both countries agreed to lift the measures in 2019. The episode underscored how quickly cross-border politics can reshape factory schedules and payrolls. Today's shift is not about closing the door, it is about making sure essential projects do not stall when rules change elsewhere.
So while that is happening, and I'm working with all the steel plants to do that, and we have a fund to support them at Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie or Dofasco or ArcelorMittal in Hamilton, we will make sure that the proponents of major projects are able to import steel that is linked to what they need while they pivot bit by bit and take Canadian steel.
Federal and provincial funding helped two Ontario giants pivot from blast furnaces to electric arc technology and new direct reduction pathways. Support totaling in the hundreds of millions of dollars is backing decarbonization at ArcelorMittal Dofasco, while another large package supports Algoma Steel's conversion, with projected emissions cuts measured at up to roughly 2/3 or more compared with legacy routes. These investments align climate goals with industrial strategy. These upgrades do more than clean up smokestacks. Electric arc furnaces are faster to restart and more flexible on product mix, which helps mills shift from auto-grade coil to plate and shapes used in bridges, shipbuilding, transmission towers, and housing. That flexibility is crucial for serving a home market where infrastructure programs, ship orders, and energy projects crest at different times. It is the opposite of being locked into a single foreign buyer's cycle. Shipbuilding shows how policy, procurement, and metallurgy converge.
So the conversations are already happening within the private sectors because there's lots of proponents that want to buy Canadian steel, that they want to support the steel sector in Canada. Everybody has, the maple leaf tattooed on their hearts right now. So my job is to make sure that these conversations are happening and that ultimately we're able to support the Canadian steel workers and aluminum workers and lumber workers.
In mid-2025, a West Coast yard signed a memorandum with Algoma Steel and a specialist distributor to qualify Canadian steel for future naval icebreaker work, a step that keeps more value in country and reduces bottlenecks. Decades of boom and bust challenge Canada's ability to keep complex maritime skills alive. A steady order book is meant to change that pattern by anchoring apprenticeships, welding qualifications, and marine systems integration at home.
So it's starting in November, but the entire policy will be fully implemented in the spring. But you have to understand also that you're asking me questions regarding major projects, but there are many other types of procurement that the government also is buying, including, for example, in defense. And we're doing that, for example, for shipyards at Irving Shipyard in Halifax or and at Seaspan in Vancouver. And already the amount of steel that they've been ordering from our Canadian steel plants has increased.
The procurement pipeline documented since 2010 shows a growing ecosystem of primes and suppliers that benefit when schedules and inputs are predictable, especially if more hull steel and plate are poured domestically. The same logic runs through energy transition and transport. A new generation of battery plants in Ontario is building a continental supply chain node for cells and packs. One project backed by a multi-billion-dollar federal-provincial package is expected to produce at significant scale in St. Thomas, while a separate joint venture in Windsor received combined public support estimated in the tens of billions of dollars to stand up manufacturing and local supplier networks. These facilities reduce reliance on imports for critical components. Policy alignment with neighboring tax rules matters here. Electric vehicle tax credits in the United States include localization tests for assembly, components, and minerals. Vehicles made in Canada and batteries with Canadian inputs can qualify under those provisions, allowing Canadian plants to serve both domestic buyers and the continental market without being shut out by origin requirements. That creates demand certainty for upstream materials and processing. Procurement rules are being tuned to reinforce those investments. Federal material prioritization measures aim to ensure that when public dollars fund bridges, ferries, icebreakers, or defense systems, the steel, aluminum, and engineered subassemblies come from Canadian mills and machine shops where capacity exists. Where capacity is still scaling, exemptions and transition periods can keep projects on schedule while mills qualify new grades. This balances speed with national interest. Domestic content in defense has an established toolset. The Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy requires winning contractors to place work in Canada equal to the value of the contract, guided by a value proposition score that favors supplier development, intellectual property retention, and export growth. That means big platforms come with obligations to buy Canadian subsystems, partner with local firms, and train Canadian workers. It is a built-in growth engine. These obligations have been in place for years, but the procurement climate now makes them more consequential. When large fleets are ordered, offset work packages and technology transfers ripple to metals, electronics, and software. Firms that once chased every export bid can now plan for multi-year domestic backlogs, invest in tooling, and qualify new grades of steel or aluminum tailored to Canadian specifications, not only those of foreign buyers. Importantly, none of this discards trade commitments among provinces or internationally. Canada's internal trade agreement still requires fair access to most public procurement, and federal policy needs to fit within those bounds. The current direction uses legitimate objectives such as security, supply resilience, and environmental outcomes to justify material priorities where appropriate while maintaining competitive processes. The lesson from the 2018 tariff episode is that single-point dependence is a weak link. When the cross-border environment tightens, projects that source widely at home are less likely to pause. By strengthening domestic mills, shipyards, and advanced manufacturers, Canada reduces schedule risk on housing, transit, clean power lines, and defense readiness, even as it keeps exporting and importing where advantages are real. Resilience is the headline outcome. Clean steel conversions also move the emissions needle. Public documents project deep cuts in carbon intensity at major Ontario mills as blast furnaces give way to direct reduction and electric arcs. that reduces compliance costs over time, meets international climate commitments, and makes Canadian steel more attractive to buyers facing border carbon measures abroad. Climate policy and industrial policy converge on the same furnaces and caster lines. Supply chains are being rebuilt piece by piece. Memoranda to qualify Canadian plate for ship programs, long-term power contracts for electrified furnaces, recycling streams to feed scrap to arcs, and skills programs that certify welders and millwrights are complementary parts. Each reform makes the next one easier, and each contract that prefers local inputs grows the business case for the next capital upgrade. Momentum compounds. Battery manufacturing will pressure upstream minerals, processing, and component fabrication. Policy watchers track debates over tax credits, critical mineral rules, and permitted sourcing. Adjustments in neighboring rules can expand or shrink eligible vehicle models in a given year, so Canadian producers hedge by diversifying mineral inputs, validating non-Chinese sources, and building regional refining capacity that can meet origin tests. That is insurance against policy swings. Critics warn about cost. Public watchdogs and analysts regularly flag budget pressures in major programs, from air fleets to naval projects. Those concerns reinforce the case for deeper domestic content and shorter supply chains where they cut risk and life cycle cost. Procurement policies that reward maintainability, local overhaul capacity, and common parts can reduce overruns that come from currency swings and long offshore logistics. Industrial policy here is fiscal prudence by another name. The long arc points to a mixed pragmatic model. Canada keeps its trade ties and continental manufacturing advantages while reserving the right to prioritize homegrown inputs for projects that touch national security, critical infrastructure, or strategic industries. That blend recognizes geography, history, and the realities of modern supply risks, and it relies on steady execution more than dramatic announcements. The outcome is capacity that lasts through many political cycles. Green steel, shipbuilding, and batteries are the visible pillars, but the approach extends to transformers, grid hardware, rolling stock, and port equipment. As standards and certifications align around Canadian production, engineering firms can write tenders that default to local grades and dimensions, cutting redesign time and waste.
What I'm saying to GM and Stellantis is we have a fund to support you. We have a way to get through this. And by the way, we were there in 2008 and 2009. We took stakes in your company. We Canadians made sure that you would be able to get through this. And a lot of Canadian taxpayers' money was involved. Now it's time for you to be there for Canadians. And that's why we'll make sure that we work with the Detroit Three, so GM, Stellantis, and Ford. We'll work also with Toyota and Honda. And also, I'll be heading to Japan and Korea later this month to make sure that that's the case.
Domestic testing labs and classification bodies then become part of the value chain, keeping high-skill work on shore. If the 2010s were about maximizing throughput for external buyers, the mid-2020s are about maximizing certainty for Canadian projects. A mill that can swing from auto sheet to bridge plate, serves housing accelerators and transit expansions without waiting for a foreign model year. A shipyard that welds Canadian plate on a Coast Guard hull anchors local suppliers for decades. A battery plant that feeds domestic assembly insulates jobs from rule changes. The calculus is straightforward. When more of the materials, parts, and expertise live inside the country, disruptions travel a shorter distance. That does not mean building everything at any cost. It means identifying choke points and using procurement to de-risk them. The process is gradual and technical, qualifying steel chemistries, certifying weld procedures, mapping supplier tiers, and writing contracts that reward domestic value without sacrificing performance. Over time, this rewiring changes corporate incentives. With clearer demand signals from government projects and continental auto rules that count Canadian content, firms can justify new furnaces, coating lines, cathode mixers, and machine tools. Those assets then support exports on stronger terms because the home market has already paid for the learning curve. Independence here is not isolation. It is the confidence that essential work proceeds regardless of distant debates. This industrial turn also reframes regional development. The Great Lakes Corridor ties green steel to stamping and ship modules. The Pacific Coast links marine systems to offshore wind components. And the St. Lawrence Network connects aluminum, hydropower, and fabrication. With procurement nudges and offset obligations, that map begins to look less like a set of isolated projects and more like a portfolio with compounding spillovers. When policy focuses on tangible capacity rather than headlines, outcomes show up as welds, billets, nacelles, and battery cells. Measured this way, the new approach is not a slogan. It is the sum of grants, contracts, standards, and qualification reports that make Canadian plants useful to Canadian needs first. The strategy is quiet by design, and its success looks like fewer stoppages, shorter lead times, and more Canadian invoices paid by Canadian projects. As the domestic base strengthens, attention turns to technology transfer and innovation. Federal innovation hubs and provincial research programs are pairing universities with manufacturers to prototype advanced steels, lightweight alloys, and digital monitoring tools that fit the next generation of infrastructure. Artificial intelligence systems now track energy use in furnaces and optimize scrap blending, cutting waste by measurable margins. The transition is as much about data as it is about metal, linking climate analytics with real-time production metrics. Investment agencies note that these programs are beginning to attract new private capital. International firms view Canada's low-carbon electricity, skilled labor force, and political stability as advantages for long-term industrial projects. By combining predictable policy with clear environmental goals, Canada positions itself as a reliable jurisdiction for energy-intensive industries that need credible paths to net zero. The same factors that once pushed companies south, scale, and speed, are now balanced by certainty and sustainability. Trade partners still matter. The United States remains Canada's largest export destination, and continental integration in autos, aerospace, and agriculture endures. What changes is the power dynamic. When Canada can meet more of its internal demand and backstop key sectors, it negotiates from stability rather than urgency. The objective is to maintain open trade while ensuring domestic capability for critical needs, a principle echoed across advanced economies adjusting to similar global shocks. Energy transition projects illustrate this principle clearly. Liquefied natural gas terminals on both coasts, new transmission lines, and renewable installations require massive quantities of steel, concrete, and electrical components. Coordinating these supply streams domestically lowers vulnerability to shipping bottlenecks and currency fluctuations. By aligning public infrastructure spending with domestic production, Canada multiplies the effect of every tax dollar while supporting steady employment in construction and manufacturing. The employment dimension is critical. Retraining programs are converting traditional steelworkers into technicians for electric arc operations, automation specialists, and energy managers. Skilled Trades Councils forecast tens of thousands of openings over the next decade as older workers retire and new facilities come online. The shift requires coordinated education funding, credential updates, and apprenticeship pipelines. When governments invest in local content, they are also investing in the people who make that content possible.